across America. Live, this is Point of View. Anderson.
You know, every time we talk about origins here on Point of View, especially when we focus on intelligent design, lots of times we talk about these so-called icons of evolution. These are various stories or illustrations that are used to promote evolution. And if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that oftentimes we quote from a book by Dr. Jonathan Wells called The Icons of Evolution, which look at some of those various statements that are made, some of these stories that are told, which turn out to, in some cases, be inaccurate, in many cases turn out to be fraudulent. And so we wanted to return to that because there is a new book out that actually kind of picks up where that one left off. It has the intriguing title, Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution. They just keep coming back. It has less to do with zombies and more to do with the fact that these ideas, which were promoted back in 2000, this is 17 years later, you might think, if those were just errors, if those were just innocent textbook errors that would eventually get fixed, why are they still in the textbooks today? Last time I spoke in a very hostile situation at a university, I ended my talk by using some of these examples and said, I don't care whether you believe in intelligent design or not. If you're a taxpayer, you have to be disturbed about the fact that your tax dollars are going for textbooks that are full of errors that should be corrected. And so, if nothing else, that's worth our discussion today, and it was certainly our discussion that night at that university. I'm welcoming back to the program here Dr. Jonathan Wells. He has two PhDs, one from the University of California at Berkeley and another one from Yale University. He is the senior fellow at the Discovery Institute for the Center for Science and Culture. Of course, he is the author of that book I mentioned, Icons of Evolution, Why Much of What We Teach About Evolution is Wrong. He's also the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intelligent Design, and a more recent book on the myth of junk DNA. Dr. Jonathan Wells, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's a pleasure to be here again, Kerby.
Let's get into some of these icons, and I know some of our listeners may be familiar with the kind of the past, but it'd be worth to cover some of those because we're talking about everything from these sort of biogenesis experiments, the Miller-Urey experiment, to the Haeckel's embryos, to the peppered moths, Darwin's finches. You wrote about those back in 2000. And again, the premise is like the zombies, these just keep coming back again, don't they?
Yes, they do. Even though in many cases they were known to be false before I wrote Icons of Evolution in 2000.
And in some respects, they go all the way back. Let me just take one that certainly is your area of expertise, the Haeckel's embryos. Anybody that's ever taken a biology class usually sees these pictures of the developing embryos of a number of different animals that have a backbone, that is so-called vertebrates. And this sort of argues for the fact that in embryology, we see basically evolution. Now, some of us actually learned the old phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. They don't use that anymore, but I'm old enough to remember that term. But the idea is that if we look at these embryos, something I know you studied in great detail, we see the evidence of evolution. Well, when Ernst Haeckel wrote about that and was even quoted by Charles Darwin, it was known to be fraudulent really like 100 years ago, wasn't it?
Yes. In fact, when Ernst Haeckel made these drawings in the 1860s, some of his colleagues accused him of fraud for basically making the embryos look much more alike than they really are. And it's been exposed many times since then. Icons of Evolution was just the most recent. Actually, in Icons, I quoted evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, who said that biologists should be both astonished and ashamed that these drawings keep appearing in textbooks, and yet they're still with us.
Well, and one of the things I've said is that you can't argue that we didn't know they were fraudulent because all sorts of people on all sorts of different perspectives recognized that they were. And so then the fallback sometimes, Dr. Wells, has been, well, it's really not in that many textbooks. And this is one of the places where, again, I benefited from your book, and we went out and found some of these pictures from all these textbooks, and you look at the top 10 textbooks used in high school classrooms, sometimes even used in college classrooms, and every one of them had it in there. So you can't really at this point say that these were just innocent textbook errors, can you?
Absolutely not. They're part of a pattern, and the pattern is, at least in their evolutionary biology modules, textbooks are designed to teach a materialistic story, the idea that we are just animals, that matter and forces are the only real things in the world. And to teach that story, they need illustrations. And so the icons are illustrations for that materialistic story.
But again, when you've talked to some of these individuals, from what I've understood, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth, it seems to me that some of them said, okay, we know they're not right. We know they're inaccurate. In some cases, we know they're fraudulent. But they tell such good stories, we just can't bear to get rid of them in our textbooks. What's the response?
That's exactly the attitude. Yes, that's their response. It has been in many cases. Back in 2000, when it was pointed out that in the case of another icon, the peppered moth, the moths don't actually rest on tree trunks in the wild normally, and the textbook photos had been staged. One Canadian biology textbook writer said, well, but students are very visual at that age, and these pictures are so good we just can't give them up.
So again, this gives you a little bit of a sense of what Dr. Jonathan Wells has been dealing with over these many years. One of the other issues I thought we might put on the table is when we talk about evolution, you make a distinction, I think it's a good one, between, say, microevolution, minor variation, and macroevolution. Whenever I find an individual saying, well, you've got to believe in evolution because you believe in antibiotic resistance by, say, bacteria or something like this, or you see slight variations among peppered moths or even among Darwin's finches, that's just minor variation, isn't it?
Yes, the distinction you make is quite valid. Actually, we're sometimes accused of, we so-called creationists, that is, are accused of having made up that distinction. But in fact, it was made in the 1930s by an evolutionary biologist to distinguish between minor changes within existing species and larger things such as the origin of new species, organs, and body plans. And so that distinction has been there for quite some time. And it's important because the Darwinian claim is that microevolution will eventually give us macroevolution. But ever since the distinction was proposed, nobody's actually provided evidence for that.
And one of the things we've talked about with Dr. Ray Bolin on this program is that there seem to be some natural limits to biological change. But we'll need to take a break. We come back, we're going to talk about some of the things in this new book, the idea of the tree of life, a chapter there, the survival of the fakest. We've already given you a little bit there. DNA, because we now know so much more about the structure of DNA. And, of course, we've had other individuals on this program talking about that. Walking whales. I think you're going to enjoy that one, as well as so-called junk DNA and so-called junk organs like the appendix. What about the human eye? What about antibiotic resistance, which we talked about just a minute ago? We have a lot to cover, but it's all part of this new book, about 230 pages, Zombie Science. We have information about it and Dr. Jonathan Wells and the Discovery Institute on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of same-sex marriage, everyone wondered what the ruling would mean to bakers, florists, photographers, and others who chose not to participate in a same-sex ceremony. Next year, we will find out. The High Court decided to take the case of Christian baker Jack Phillips when two men visited his Masterpiece Cakes bakery in 2012 and asked for a same-sex wedding cake. He refused. The men filed a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and launched a campaign against Phillips. Lower courts ruled that Jack Phillips discriminated against the two men and was ordered to make cakes for homosexuals. Phillips has said that he would close down the bakery before he would compromise his beliefs. The Supreme Court decision in his case will likely have a far-reaching impact in other cases. The court's decision may also determine the fate of Aaron and Melissa Klein of Sweet Cakes in Oregon and Baronelle Stutzman of Arlene's Flowers in Washington and other such cases. In the Supreme Court decision, Justice Kennedy did make room for religious disagreement with same-sex marriage in what some have called the golden paragraph. He added that it must be emphasized that religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that by divine precepts same-sex marriage should not be condoned. He went on to assure religious groups that the First Amendment gives proper protection to those beliefs. Will that paragraph be enough to protect Jack Phillips and other Christians of conscience? I doubt it. It may give some slight protection to churches and Christian groups, but I doubt that it will protect Christians who are accused of violating anti-discrimination laws and public accommodation laws. As you can see, the case next year will be a very important case. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view. Dr. Jonathan Wells with us today as we talk about his new book, Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution. And as listeners, let me for just a minute have you in your mind's eye kind of think of a tree that has a trunk and has various branches and then twigs. And Jonathan, Dr. Wells, let's, if we can, talk about Charles Darwin, because in his book, of course, he talks about the idea and the origin of species of a great tree of life. Now, the first part of the problem with that tree that you talk about is it doesn't seem to have a trunk. And we've been privileged to have on the program with us Dr. Stephen Meyer, who wrote the book Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. But whether you look at that book or other books, the first problem with Darwin's tree of life is that we don't seem to have that trunk. All of a sudden, so many different animal species show up abruptly in the geological column, don't they?
Yes, that's called the Cambrian explosion. And actually, Darwin knew about it and knew it was a problem for his theory. But of course, he went ahead and defended his theory anyway.
But the problem is that you, of course, have, as you say, the case of the missing trunk. But then you have as well just all the other branches, the twigs, and those kinds of things. One of the arguments you make here is that sometimes fossils really can't necessarily answer the question. It can't really establish the ancestor-descendant relationship. Why so?
Well, imagine you found two human skeletons in a field without some kind of identifying marks or perhaps some DNA. You could not tell whether they were related to each other in any way other than that they're members of the same species. So when you find two fossils of different species, widely separated in time and space, there is absolutely no way, really, reliably, to connect them in a chain of ancestry and descent. So that's one problem. The other problem with the tree of life is that it runs into conflicts everywhere from the trunk to the branches. You can construct a tree from fossils or from molecules, and if you use different fossils or different molecules, you get a different tree. Well, if the tree were true, there would only be one. But the evidence is all over the place.
Since you mentioned molecules, of course, again, you have a PhD in molecular and cell biology. Some of the listeners might now, skeptics might say, okay, well, maybe I can't establish them with fossils, but I can with DNA because we have, that's a big word, phylogenetic trees. In other words, we can look at the genetic similarity. We can compare DNA to DNA, and then we can create something that Charles Darwin could not because he didn't have access to these genetic tools. What I just heard you say is that if you try to do so, it doesn't bring the clear kind of answers that you might have expected.
Absolutely right. Darwin did not know about the molecules. Modern biologists do. But one thing to remember is that when we're comparing molecules, with very rare exceptions, all of them are from living organisms. So anything we infer about the past, we're inferring from living organisms. A bigger problem is that depending on which organisms or which molecules we choose, we get different trees. And as I said a minute ago, if the tree were real, there would be one tree, and the more we study the evidence, the more we should converge on that one tree, and the opposite has happened.
You got more contradictions than you got rules, and after a while you start realizing you don't have to have a class in statistics to figure out that one is certainly a problem. In your chapter on the survival of the ficus, we already, of course, talked about the embryos, Haeckel's embryos, but another one that everybody hears about, if for no other reason there was an individual that won a Pulitzer Prize for it, was this idea of Darwin's finches. And when I was in graduate school at Yale, I actually had a chance to look at the finches from the Galapagos Islands. But this is another one that shows up in the textbooks, and you write about in some detail in your book, because they are, first of all, assuming erroneously that it was the finches that Darwin looked at that really gave rise to the theory of evolution. It was not. But number two, they also assume that these minor variations in these finches actually prove evolution. What have you found?
Well, you're quite right. Darwin was not inspired by the finches, despite the myth that is retold in the biology textbooks. But more importantly, when biologists camped out on the Galapagos Islands and actually studied these finches, a severe drought occurred. It killed, in this one particular population, it killed all the birds with smaller beaks, and so only the birds with large beaks survived. So the next generation tended, on average, to have larger beaks. But when the rains came back, the birds with the smaller beaks came back too, and so the average returned to normal. So what we have here is a case of minor change within an existing species that actually turned out to oscillate through time. It didn't even go anywhere.
Wow. Okay, again, back to your background in molecular and cell biology. A lot of people will say, okay, I recognize a lot of mutations are deleterious. They are downward. They don't give you anything new. But what about these four-winged fruit flies? Now, that's something where you all of a sudden go from 2 wings to 4 wings. And so this is one that has oftentimes been used as well to say, well, here's an example of what is a mutation of some sort that gives us a new sort of novel opportunity to look at how maybe evolution would take place. Again, with your background, how do you respond to this idea of these 4-winged fruit flies?
Well, you're quite right that they are used as evidence for the power of mutations. But it's not so sudden. Actually, the 4-winged fruit fly is a product of careful genetic engineering. 3 separate mutations have to be combined in a single embryo to make the 4-winged fruit fly. So it's not just a sudden freak of nature. But more importantly, the second pair of wings are effectively dead. 4-winged fruit fly is kind of like a small plane with an extra pair of wings dangling from its tail. So it has trouble flying and mating, and it really can't survive outside the laboratory. So it's more like a sideshow freak than evidence for evolution.
So again, you don't get, as you've said in your previous book, you don't get a more advanced fruit fly. You don't get a horse fly. You certainly don't get a horse. And so again, some of the things that you usually see as evidence usually are not the case. One more I thought I'd mention just before we take a break, because this one comes close to my experience. When I was at Yale University, the office I had was in the old home of Othniel Marsh, who was the individual as a paleontologist at Yale who went out to really try to prove evolution, because after reading Charles Darwin, he really wanted to begin to show very good examples of sort of a finely graduated chain. And so for many years, Dr. Wells, we have seen these pictures of these various horses, the so-called horse evolution. And so you begin to see these all developing in North America. But once again, when you look at that and you now see some of the latest research, haven't most evolutionists set aside that picture that was so famous and was established by Dr. Marsh back in the 19th century?
You're quite right. And you're right about his motivation. He liked Darwin's theory, and he set out to find evidence. Well, the horse series, which originally supposedly showed a sort of straight-line evolution from a multi-toed animal to a single-toed animal, turned out to be a misrepresentation of the actual fossil evidence. The actual evidence shows a very bushy sort of evolutionary history with a lot of dead ends, and the immediate ancestors of the next one in the line are not obvious. And so instead of showing straight-line evolution, biologists started to argue that it provided evidence for branching evolution or undirected evolution. Well, nowadays, actually, you don't even see the horses so much anymore.
Right.
They've been replaced pretty much by other fossil series, such as the whales.
Well, we're going to take a break, and we're going to talk about the walking whales and things of that nature. But also, you up until now said, well, you haven't said anything about so-called human evolution. And so we'll come back and talk about one of the arguments you've heard. If you've seen it in any kind of science magazine, you've probably seen it in popular magazines, that basically we're 99% chimp. In other words, the similarities between us and a chimpanzee are incredible, which will get us into some of the conversation about DNA, the secret of life. And then we're going to talk about these walking whales, because that's the one that sort of has replaced the horses. That's a whole chapter, which is fascinating, about these creatures that supposedly came off of land, went into the water, and whales ultimately have their ancestors back on land. So we have a lot more to talk about. But along the way, if you find yourself wanting to maybe join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Most importantly, though, I encourage you maybe to sit back, take some notes, but most importantly, get a copy of the book. If you have some young people headed off to college, maybe even right now in high school, and they're looking at their biology book and saying, Mom, Dad, what about this? A lot of the answers to those questions are found in these books on the icons of evolution, in particular the new book, Zombie Science. We'll have more right after this.
And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Also have a link to iconsofevolution.com. There you can find the previous book, but especially this book, Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution. And there's a way for you to buy it. There's a trailer for you to watch. You might want to watch that and hit the share button and then pass it on to your friends and maybe post it on your Facebook page. And so there's lots of great material available at our website, pointofview.net. that will link you to Discovery Institute as well as Icons of Evolution on this topic, zombie science. With us, as still, is Dr. Jonathan Wells. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Wells, what about this? We hear this all the time, that when we look at the DNA of chimpanzees and the DNA of human beings, that basically we're 99% chimps. How do we respond to that?
Well, it's at least close to the truth. The percentage is probably not quite that high, but it is in the 90s, I think.
Sure.
Probably. The thing is, when you look at humans and chimps, we look anatomically quite similar. So, in a sense, the DNA is only telling us what we already knew, that there's a certain similarity there. But what it also tells us is that since we know there are major differences between humans and chimps, not only anatomically but behaviorally, that the DNA does not contain all the information. And that's one of the things I write about in Zombie Science. In fact, I call DNA now an icon of evolution because it has become this sort of gold standard by which we're to judge everything. But in fact, we know from embryology and cell biology that there are other sources of information in the cell besides the DNA. In fact, they're much greater magnitude than the DNA. So the DNA is just part of the story. There's a lot more going on there. And to say that we're 99% similar at the level of DNA isn't really telling us much, except that there's obviously something else going on.
Let's talk about genetics for just a minute. You know, we've had Dr. Paul Nelson on here, and I love the way he said it. You know, let's give Charles Darwin his due. In the 19th century, he came up with this idea of natural selection, so we'll give him credit there. But he knew nothing about DNA. As a matter of fact, this idea of the cell being a black box is because, again, if you've ever looked through a light microscope, it just looks like a bag of goo. It's called protoplasm. But we now know, because of electron microscopes and all sorts of other kinds of technologies, that DNA is a lot more complex than we ever would have imagined. And you also talked about this idea of other kinds of genetic material, epigenetics, which you talk about there. Can you speak to that issue for just a minute? Because we now know much more about genetics than Charles Darwin knew. And what we do know about DNA really seems to be challenging kind of the fundamental tenets of evolution. Would you agree?
Well, yes. The fact is that the DNA does contain information, and this information cannot be explained as the product of random processes, unguided processes. It's actually evidence for design. But what I'm saying is that even beyond the design in DNA, we have design elsewhere in the cell and the embryo
Right.
that actually exceeds the design in the DNA. One example would be when something is transcribed from DNA, it has to go somewhere in the cell to do its job. It has to go to the right place. If it goes to the wrong place, the cell dies. So how does it know where to go? Well, it knows where to go because there are patterns in the cell, and I write particularly about patterns in the cell membrane,
Mm-hmm.
that are there before the DNA is even activated. So there's information independent of the DNA that's absolutely necessary.
Again, for those of you that maybe have a biology background, or maybe you have a young person in your world that maybe wants to study genetics, maybe wants to go into medicine, interested in this whole area, I will just simply say that chapter would be very helpful. And again, just a very powerful argument for intelligent design. We've talked about this before in some other books, but again, it's in chapter 4 of this book. But I want to move on to one that you mentioned, because this is one that I think gets everybody smiling, and that is the story of the walking whales. Just as we used to have a story of these very small horses, Eohippus, now called Hyracotherium, all the way up to Equus. Now you have these stories of these very small animals eventually leading to the blue whale. So you've dedicated a whole chapter. So give us just a little bit of a background on this idea of walking whales, because this one seems to be the one that is showing up often, and you've done a very good job of doing some critique of this pattern called the walking whales.
Yes, well, in Darwin's time, there were 2 fossils of actual whales known, true whales, that is, fully aquatic animals that live their entire lives in the water. But there were no intermediate fossils at the time showing that these whales descended from land animals, and yet that was the idea that they must have, because land animals appear in the fossil record earlier than the whales. So Darwin imagined a bear swimming, catching bugs, and its mouth growing larger under the pressure of natural selection until it produced an animal with a mouth as big as a whale. Well, people laughed at him for that, so he took it out of the later editions of the Origin of Species, but he still believed it. So years later, actually in the 1980s, more than a century later, in other words, paleontologists found the fossil of a wolf-sized animal that had in its ear a bone that up to that point had only been found in whales and dolphins and porpoises. So based largely on that bone, they called the animal Pakicetus, or Pakistani whale. Well, it didn't look at all like a whale. It looked more like a wolf. But they called it a whale anyway. And since then, other fossils have been discovered that Darwinian evolutionists argue are intermediate between Pakicetus and modern whales. In fact, the other fossils look more like sea lions or sea otters than they do whales. Whales are quite different from sea lions and sea otters, which live on land and spend a lot of their time in the water. So this series of fossils, often fancifully depicted by skilled artists, makes it look as though Pakicetus gradually evolved into modern whales. But in fact, there are many discontinuities in the series. In fact, one particular animal, there's not a single case where a particular animal could evolve into the next one in the series, because in each case they would have to lose features before moving on. So it's, once again, a story in search of illustrations. And the fossils, or rather the drawings based on the fossils, are the illustrations. But the story of how this happened remains unexplained.
One of the things you talk about is what it takes to make a whale, and most of us don't think about whales unless we've wanted to do a whole study of cetaceans and things like that, but you need certain features for swimming, you need certain features for breathing because they have like blowholes, you need certain features for reproduction. It is a very complex set of, if you will, assumed evolutionary novelties that all have to arise for you to have anything that even begins to function in the way that a whale does, right?
That's correct. to live exclusively in the water, as whales do. They have to have special adaptations for swimming, like their tail flukes, which are very different from anything that a sea lion or a land animal has. And they're also different from swim flippers. Swim flippers are passive. Flukes are active. They actually propel the whale through the water. They have special breathing apparatus, as you say, the blowhole on top of the head, which is normally kept closed in a whale. The nostrils of other animals are kept open and have to be closed by the animal when the animal submerges. It's the opposite with whales. They have special lung fluids that help them re-expand their lungs when they come to the surface after a long dive. Their chests collapse during the dive because the pressure is too great, and they collapse because they're designed to collapse. Their reproductive systems are adapted to fully aquatic lifestyle. Nursing underwater is very different from nursing on land. And the list goes on and on. It's quite long.
Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll talk about so-called human evolution. What about the appendix? What about junk DNA? What about the human eye? I mean, Charles Darwin in The Origin of Species said that just caused him to shudder. And so what about some of the things that we see there? And if you'd like to join us, we'll see if we can slip in a phone call or two, 1-800-351-1212. If you're just joining us, talking with Dr. Jonathan Wells for a few more minutes as we talk about his new book, Zombie Science, More Icons of Evolution. It is published by the Center for Science and Culture. We have a link to the website so that you can watch the trailer about it and also order the book. And I think especially if you have young people that are interested in science but really have some fundamental questions about the origins issue and their Christian convictions, I think they will find these books very helpful. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Not long ago, we examined Article 6 of the Constitution, which prohibits the application of a religious test for office. The point of this provision is to both prevent the exclusion of religious individuals from office and to ensure good and wise citizens of every stripe can serve the country. Recent Senate confirmation hearings brought Article 6 to the national stage, raising questions of religious liberty. Senator Bernie Sanders questioned nominee Russell Vought over an article in which he examined a passage from the Gospel of John defending the exclusivity of Christ in salvation according to Vaught's Christian faith. Sanders decried Vaught's conclusion that followers of other faiths, and Islam in particular, were condemned according to Vaught's explanation of the Christian faith. I won't debate the theological correctness of Vaught's arguments, but it's worth noting that at the conclusion of questioning, Senator Sanders announced he would vote against Vaught, not over any professional qualification, but because, quote, this nominee is really not someone who is what this country is supposed to be about, unquote. Senators can vote for or against executive nominees for nearly any reason, but for one to publicly question a nominee's religious faith, pronounce it disagreeable, and withhold his vote expressly because of the nominee's faith makes me wonder if, in fact, the senator from Vermont may have created a religious test for office in violation of the Constitution. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org. We'll
take some phone calls in just a minute, but again, we're talking with Dr. Jonathan Wells. Just before we take a phone call, let's talk about this idea of junk, because if evolution is true, then you would expect that you would have junk DNA. You'd have leftover DNA that had no purpose. You would assume that we have junk organisms and organs, like, for example, the appendix is sometimes cited. It's sort of the flotsam and jetsam of an evolutionary period. But you have a whole chapter here pointing out that first, when we look at the appendix, it actually has a lot more functions than maybe we originally assumed. And when we look at all this so-called junk DNA, and of course you've written an entire book on this subject, the junk DNA is not so much junk after all. So some of the things that you would predict that would exist if evolution were true, now that we look at it with a more critical eye, haven't really been borne out, have they?
No, they haven't. Charles Darwin himself actually cited the appendix, saying that it was useless and therefore could not have been produced by natural selection. So he concluded it was an accidental byproduct of unguided evolution. Well, that was 1859. By 1900, it was known that the appendix does have a function. It's part of our immune system that helps to protect us from disease. And that's been known since 1900. Yet some modern biologists in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s are now arguing, again, like Darwin, that the appendix is useless. Well, the evidence is out there showing that they're wrong, but they ignore it.
And when we talk about the junk DNA, we found out that supposedly all this leftover DNA in the human genome actually has a function that people did not realize until they studied it further.
Correct. When the structure of DNA was discovered by Watson and Crick in 1953, it was soon learned that most of our DNA does not code for protein. In fact, only about 2% of it does. So some biologists, not all, but some biologists at the time, argued that the other 98% were, like the appendix, junk left over from evolution. Well, some biologists disagreed, and by the 2000s, it was becoming clear that this other DNA, the non-protein coding DNA, actually does have function. And in 2012, a series of papers came out produced by over 400 biologists working in separate laboratories, showing that probably upwards of 80% of our DNA is actually functional. Well, what's interesting is the response of the Darwinian evolutionary biologists to this, who argue that, well, if this is not junk, then evolution is wrong. But evolution can't be wrong, therefore this must be junk, regardless of the evidence.
Incredible. Let's take a few phone calls before we run out of time here today. We'll head out to California first. Raymond, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yes, thank you.
What would be your comment?
Yes, what was the last species on the tree of Darwin's life before humans?
You're talking about like Homo erectus or Homo australopithecus, something like that?
Exactly.
The last species before humans. Actually, that's a matter of a great deal of controversy, even now. The history of human origins is muddy, and it seems that with each fossil discovery, it gets muddier. So there is no agreement as to what our direct ancestor might have been, if in fact we had one.
And I think what Raymond wanted to get to is, if indeed evolution is true, would you still expect evolution to be taking place? I mean, today we don't see evolution, and so the argument is, since we don't see it in the biology area, maybe we'll see it in the evolutionary areas in terms of geology, but you don't really see it there either, so you just have some difficulty trying to see why we aren't evolving further. Of course, I know there's some that would like to take control using genetic engineering of human evolution and evolve a super race, but that's maybe a question for another day. Let me take another phone call real quickly and go to Ohio. Larry, I think you'd like to join our conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Yes. I see so many problems with evolution in the design of the human cell. The DNA itself, and this is what I think I've learned, so if I say something wrong, you can correct me. But DNA is base 4 in the number system, and it meaning there's 4 different combinations for each codon that's in the DNA ladder, and it uses 3 at a time in order to assemble one of 20 amino acids. So 4 to the third power is 64. That would give 64 possible combinations to make to select an amino acid, and the body uses about 20. So the average protein that the body is made of, all these proteins from amino acids, would be about 150 amino acid string, that many in a row. So to get like the first one right, you have one chance out of 20 to make the proper protein. To get 2 right, 20 to the second power would be 400, one chance out of 400. The third one chance out of 8,000. To get all 150 right, it's 20 to the 150th power.
That's a huge number, isn't it?
That's a huge number. They think there's 10 to the 80 atoms in the known universe.
So the point I think you're making, just since we're getting a little tight on time, is Jonathan Wells, we've talked in the past about the book Signature in the Cell, which is, again, written by one of your colleagues, Stephen Meyer. But I think Larry's giving us a very good idea that when you start looking at these probabilities, the numbers get so high, it's not improbable. It's essentially impossible, isn't it?
It's impossible for it to happen by accident or by unguided processes. Two people here in Seattle who've done a lot of work on that at the Biologic Institute, which is affiliated with Discovery, are Doug Axe and Ann Gager. And they have performed experiments showing that, in fact, what your caller is saying is true.
And we've had Doug Axe on the program because that book is also one that I would certainly recommend to individuals to know more about, because it's just, once again, helping us understand that things are, if you will, undeniable, how biology confirms our intuition that life is designed. So just another book that we would mention as well. Jonathan Wells, let me just mention real quickly that we do have a link to your website, and the website is iconsofevolution.com. And so there's a place where people can buy the book if they'd want to. There's also a trailer, and my assignment to everybody is it's only about a minute plus, and I would encourage people to watch the trailer, maybe then hit that share button, put it on their Facebook page, send it maybe to someone that doesn't know about this, or put it in a blog or an email or something of that nature, and promote it as well. But what else is available at your website when people land there?
Oh, all sorts of articles and books, many of them available for free download. For example, Survival of the Fakest, an article I published in 2001, which is about the original 10 icons, is freely available. So I highly recommend that website.
Well, again, I appreciate you being on the program with us again. We oftentimes have quoted from the book Icons of Evolution. Now I will certainly plan on doing a commentary on zombie science and use it when I teach. And thank you so very much for spending some time with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's been a real pleasure.
Again, Dr. Jonathan Wells, if you'd like to know more about him, we have information about him on our website, pointofview.net. And if you would like to go back and listen to this again, maybe some of it came a little bit too fast, maybe it's been a while since you've had a science class, and you'd like to kind of think it through, let me just mention that you can hit that listen button and listen to it, or even download the podcast and listen to it, or pass it on to someone else. Shortly, we'll have it up on our YouTube channel so you can watch that as well. So Zombie Science is the latest book in this ongoing discussion about icons of evolution. It is certainly helpful to you to understand some of these issues, and for young people if they are wondering about these issues. But as I've said before, our tax dollars are paying for textbooks that are inaccurate, in some cases fraudulent. That's reason enough for us to speak out. Let's take a break. We'll get back into the news cycle right after this.